Perfect. Thank you. All right, I think we're on week 4. Yeah, cool. So welcome to week 4 of our kind of walkthrough proposing kind of how we expect and would like proposals to be successful. So this week we're going to cover analyses, and this is so variable. I was like, I'd really love to be able to give more like explicit instructions, but it just really depends on your design. But so we'll give you some basic ideas for structure where you can put things in a good structure. And I was telling everyone before we started that I had been reading a dissertation defense, and so I have a lot of feelings about structure right now. So I think structuring things by research question tends to make it the most manageable, but you'll see that kind of in our suggestions for outlines here. All right, so we're going to cover what are the requirements, what do you need to have, the suggested structure of what the section might look like, some lessons learned that we've been doing each week. A lot of these concepts are probably going to overlap a little bit with last week because, sometimes methods sort of lead you to specific analyses, and then we'll allow everybody to ask questions. All right. So, and I'll try not to talk quite so long this time. I felt bad last week. So from the submission guidelines, the PSA level requirements, right? So we would need your proposed analysis pipeline. And that includes, like what is the data screening? What are the exclusion rules for the data? We've mentioned this before in the methods. So there's participant inclusion rules, right? So you might not want, like one of our studies has used restrictions on they should be a native of the country that they're in, right? That's an inclusion rule for participants. But then you might have a different rule within the analyses about like they have to pass these attention checks. So we talked about that in the methods because you got to say that you're using that. But here you would put it as part of the pipeline, right? The first thing we're going to do is exclude everybody who's missing 10% or more of their data, and then participants who can't get the questions right, that kind of thing. So including those pre-processing steps, not just the brain fart, not just the analysis steps. Now, if your methods include something like, we're going to use this specific scale and it's got a composite score, like I'm thinking like if you did an assignment task, for example, you would calculate this D score, you would talk about how those variables are calculated. That could go in the methods or the results. Like those kind of like, to me, could go in either place. But making it clear how each variable is calculated is really useful. Okay. And a description of the planned analyses. So how do your research questions map onto the analysis you'll use? If you're doing sort of traditional frequentist approach, having corrections for multiple comparisons, if you have them, right? Any covariates or other regressors. So any kind of variable that you're going to use to control for error, or variables that you'll use to control for some other known facet. And then the last one, which isn't always, we don't, in research papers don't always make super obvious, but what is it that's going to tell you that the result is what you expected or not, right? So if you want to use p less than 0.05, that's fine, but you would say, I'm going to use a two-tailed test, p less than 0.05, and if the probability is less than 0.05, then, hypothesis 1 will be supported. And that kind of goes back into table 1. So table 1 keeps sneaking in here. Thank goodness we can copy this slide, but you'll see it'll make a reappearance here. If you haven't seen it before, I'll explain it on that slide. So in a frequentist system, this is your traditional null hypothesis testing. You should include a power analysis. And we're going to do power analyses next week on kind of like I'm going to give you kind of more of a hands-on demo for power analyses and tell you it doesn't have to be scary. And then separately, if you want to use one of our open times to get to like, say, here's what I want to do, help me do the power, I'm happy to do that. Okay. But some sort of power analysis, we need a justification of the sample size. You can use adaptive sampling. So the SpamL project used an adaptive system. The stereotype threat had an adaptive system where they were collecting data until it met this criteria. That's also allowed as a justification. So really, it's not just about power, it's a justification for the sample size, which generally is Okay? And so that could be based on effect sizes that are from the literature. You could also say the effect sizes in the literature are awful suspicious. So I'm going to use a meaningful effect size, sometimes called the smallest effect size of interest. And so I've got a link in here to some examples that people have used ASSOCI. It really could be, I'm only interested if the effect is 0.15, D equals 0.15. Like that's a perfectly valid justification. But you would have to figure out what is the most meaningful small effect for you. Okay? And as somebody who's on like a research team who talks about this a lot, that's a really hard concept sometimes to know like what would be meaningful to me as a small effect. So I'm happy to help you think about that, but sometimes it just matters. It could be like, I only care if it's not zero. And you could define not zero as like 0.001. Okay? And so that's valid. I think in the, I talk about the SPAML because I know it best. The rule was that the confidence interval of the effect size should not include zero, and zero was defined as 0.0001. Okay? So we just wanted the lower end of the confidence interval to literally not be zero. Okay? But obviously to find that requires a lot more power. So having kind of maybe a couple of different effect sizes could be good too. Like I might expect it to be this because the literature says, but I'm also kind of suspicious because the Open Science Collaboration has shown that effect sizes that are published are the best possible scenario. So if I take a half of that, here's what power would say. So there's a lot of approaches you can take here, but some sort of justification that isn't N is 50 because that sounds good. All right. For things that are really, really uncertain, you could actually propose a, it's not an adaptive design. So in the stereotype threat study, for example, it's an adaptive design. So the probability of each of the conditions, so there's 6 conditions in that study, the likelihood of getting one of them actually adjusts during the study based on the previous results. But you could do a adaptive looking kind of procedure where you are saying, okay, after every week, we're going to analyze the design, and if our effect size is met, we're going to stop. Okay, so you can actually also propose these sort of adaptive ending criteria. But likely you need a minimum as well. So with those types of adaptive designs, you usually have a minimum, a stopping rule, and a maximum. If you have more questions about that kind of concept, we can do that for the open date. But I've also given several lectures on this that I have recorded if you're interested in like minimum and maximum rules. And generally the minimum rule might be 50, 30 participants, some magic number. But the stopping rule is the interesting part. Like, okay, we're going to stop sampling if the standard error of our effect is this size, because that implies that we have measured it well. Okay. The other place you can look up this type of idea is anything by Ken Kelly at Notre Dame, and it's called accuracy and parameter estimation. So instead of estimating based on power, you're estimating based on, I just want to measure this thing really well. And here's what that suggests. And that's really helpful if you have things where you're just like, I have no idea what the effect size might be. So like, why don't we just measure it well? Okay. And I've done a little bit of work in that area, so I can kind of help you figure out what that might mean. Okay. But you should say how often you're going to look. So if you use accuracy and parameter estimation, you actually don't have to do too much type 1 error correction, but what you do instead of focusing on P is you focus on the confidence interval. Those two things are heavily related though. So you kind of have to say, okay, I want my confidence interval to be this specific size. So the goal being that you're going to find a sufficiently narrow confidence interval. This is their words. Like I have enough people that the confidence interval is only 2 points, for example. But as long as you aren't trying to say that the confidence interval isn't 2 points with 0, right? You wouldn't have to correct for type 1 because you're not asking, is it significant when you look? You're asking, is the confidence interval measured well enough when you look? Okay. So what my goal is for explaining this is that there are lots of ways to justify sample size that don't have to be a scary simulation power analyses that I think everyone's nervous about, right? It could be simple, like this is my smallest meaningful effect, and we'll stop when we measure that really well. Or it could be a traditional power analysis, or it could be like each week we're going to check, and if our confidence interval over time stops changing, we're going to stop. Okay? So there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but having a hard stopping rule is also important, right? I want to collect up to X amount because we don't want to, you know, these projects already take long enough. So we want to have a place that we know that we can quit and be done with it. Right? So lots of different ways to handle sort of the frequentist paradigm. Bayesian a little bit easier. There are lots of ways to do Bayesian power analyses. I am not the person to ask for that one, but I will find you a person if you need help in that arena. And whatever you might use, like a Bayes factor or more traditional Bayes analysis, I don't know that we've had anybody do that. Have we seen? I don't think so. I know the stereotype threat study is using Bayes factors. So their stopping rule and their adjustment criterion are actually based on Bayes factors and not traditional frequentist p-values. Okay. But what happens is what their goal was is that we'll collect up to, I think it was like 2,100 or 2,400 people, or when these Bayesian rules all meet this criteria. And so that's how they handled that. Okay. But within that, you should specify all the, you know, what does the prior represent in this? Oh, it might be an uninformed prior. That's okay. What are the rules for the distribution? So I'm thinking of the Bayes factor package, like having the criteria you use to calculate this. And the description of what an outcome neutral criteria might be. So with Bayesian hypotheses, obviously you could say that the result is zero, right? It's a different framework, so it allows you to actually claim a null, you know, no effect in a sense. So what does that look like? So some people use what's called ROPE, which can I remember what ROPE stands for? Region of Practical Equivalence. Okay, so you're saying that this here, if our effect is between here and here, we're saying that there's no, the support is for a null model. Okay. So having those ranges of like what you would say if the result shows X, right? In this region, we would say that it supports model 1. In this region, we would say it supports a null model. And that's really important for Bayes. Now, in a frequentist hypothesis framework, right, we don't tend to claim that the null is supported, right, because of the setup of those designs, but you could include something like a test of a one-sided effect that would show like practically this is zero. So there are ways to also do that in frequentism. I have done some of that if you're interested. Okay. Whoops, sorry, I got excited. And then qualitative studies, because we're really trying to push folks to not always have to do just normal experimental research, but if you're doing exploratory or qualitative research, right, how are you going to process that data? And how is that appropriate for what you're doing? And then any mixed methodology frameworks, if applicable. So most qualitative studies do have a specific framework that they're going to work in, and they're going to process the data this way. And then I included a link here for a really great paper on what's called saturation. So in qualitative studies, you want to have some sort of suggestion on when you should stop. Okay? And generally that's described as saturation, meaning you don't, more participants would not give you any new information. Okay? So we did a little bit of this in a study where I was looking at migraines, where we were doing patient interviews. And so we were able to say after 10 patients, we weren't learning any new, you know, there was no new answers coming up. So that had reached saturation. And so I assume if you're a qualitative person, you've heard this word before, but if you're interested, there's a link here that has kind of a nice, how do I determine sample size for qualitative studies paper. And if you need access to it, because APA is one of the worst, let me know and we will magic you access to it. All right, so some considerations. So those are just kind of like if these different frameworks, here's some ideas for them. Okay. But some basic ideas is that whatever you propose to do likely will not be what you end up doing. Okay, so the analyses and the power estimates will likely change as other folks get their hands involved, so to speak, because someone might have a better design type or suggestion for power, or, oh, hey, by the way, there's this new study out that suggests X is the appropriate effect size, so to speak. So your proposal should be a best guess. Okay. I'll say this again on the week we do power, but every time you do a power estimate, it is literally probably wrong, but sometimes they're useful. Okay, as a play on all models are wrong, but some are useful. Power analyses are pretty much always wrong, but sometimes they're helpful. Okay. So don't feel like, oh, I'm going to get it wrong. Okay, if you start with the framework that it's probably wrong, but I'm going to do my very best to tell you what I think should happen, that's what we're looking for. Okay. And this mostly will help us gauge feasibility. And if you think the effect basically isn't there, so let's say you're trying to do a study that shows like, hey, this thing that people say is there probably isn't there, then you could say the power estimate would be super duper high, but instead we would love for you to find someone to help us with tests of one-sided effects to show that it isn't there. And what sample size do we need to do that? Okay. I think those kinds of studies are super fun, but we just have to kind of change the normal approach to make sure we can support our claim that it isn't there, if that's what you're trying to show. Okay. And then we'll do a whole week on power. Okay. And I'll kind of show you some of G-Power because it's really pretty easy. And then a little bit of some R packages that I really love, like Lisa DeBrine's faux package is actually pretty user-friendly. Until you break it, and then she gets mad at you, which I have done several times. So how should we structure this section? Okay. I would say the methods actually is probably one of the most important sections because for feasibility purposes, that's really what we're going to look at. Like, I think most people tend to focus in on the methods. Can we get enough labs who can run this? And then it gets into the analyses. But when I'm looking at these, as long as you don't propose an analysis that I'm like, I have no idea how this relates to what you're doing, then I'm like, okay, cool, but it'll probably change. Okay. So starting with some data cleaning. And this is the way my brain works. Feel free to adjust this order. So these are just suggestions, but I usually start with like, what did I have to do to get the data into the right shape, right? So if we might have to remove duplicates or correct any errors that people make. So this depends on the methods really. What are you going to do with missing values? You're excluding them? Because I mean, we're almost ready to start data collection for one of the JTF projects. And I finally realized that between the lead author and myself, we had a totally different set of rules for missing values. So I think being upfront, like I'm going to calculate participants' average scores based on the items they have. Don't care if they're missing. Or I'm going to exclude anyone who's missing more than 5% of their data. So just clarifying, like, what are you doing with missing scores? Because there will be some, right? And then what kind of values do you expect, right? So literally this morning, we were working on some data that the date formats are, I don't know what's going on with them, right? So on one person's computer, the date format was working fine. On my computer, definitely was not. So, how do you expect to handle that? You might not have that problem, but like, if you have categorical data, what are you going to do if one of the cells is empty, right? So if there's 4 groups and no one ever admits to being in group 4, what happens? I don't know that would happen, but just an idea. So what are we doing to clean the data? And then what are you doing to handle the missing data? Okay. So you could use multiple imputation methods. And you can say, we'll use multiple imputation methods. And if you're like, I don't know how to do that, we'll help you find someone. Or just, you could say, I'm going to exclude it. We're going to collect a ton of data. We expect participants to miss a question here or there, and we'll just exclude them when we need to. So there's lots of choices here, but making that pretty clear is useful. because that might change feasibility, right? If you expect more than half the participants to miss an item because the test is really hard, for example, that would mean that your estimates need to increase on how many you need if you're going to exclude them. And so like from the spam study, what I said was like, people will miss items. It's not a big deal. It's usually 5% or less. And those just get excluded and we continue on about our merry way. We don't have to exclude the whole participant when they miss an item. All right. Then the suggestion is to talk about each research question or hypothesis or whatever. We'll kind of one at a time. Like, what is the independent variable and dependent variable? If you want to go like old school intro to statistics on this, that is actually pretty helpful to say, we're going to run a regression analysis where the dependent variable is social anxiety and the independent variable is ethnic group. Like, that's cool, because then it's very clear, like, here are the analyses that I'm wanting to do. And if you have, I have all of, I have these 6 predictors and I'm really, this one's research question 1, and this one's research question 2, you could probably combine to say this analysis answers all 3 of these, for example, and any interactions that you might expect. And so this kind of, I'm trying to tie this back to like, if you have these research questions at the end of the introduction, my personal preference, and I do this when I'm reviewing, is can I map from what's the question to how is it being assessed in the methods to how it's being analyzed in the results. So like drawing the reader from each piece, because then I don't have quite as many questions of like, what are you actually measuring? And how is that being analyzed? And how does that answer your research question? And I'm like, okay, cool. This variable's for this analysis, and here's the design. So I stuck table 1 back in here. I actually hated this when I had to do it, but I think it helps you make that connection between things clear, right? So your analysis plan could be as simple as a one-way ANOVA, IV here, DV here. If P is less than 0.05, hypothesis supported. If P is greater than 0.05, no result. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. See if we can put table 1 in every week, so just for fun. All right, so within each one, we've talked about like define the variables, right? Forward. Here, what are the models you're going to use? Okay, so regression, ANOVA, multi-level model, could be factor analysis, because I know somebody's mentioned some scale development. For qualitative studies, it could be thematic analysis. I don't know enough about mixed methods to say anything intelligent. Bayes, it could be parameter estimation. So lots of ideas here. It doesn't necessarily have to be like model, like how cognitive people would use this term. Any assumptions that you need to test and what you might do if they fail. Okay. Generally, the rule has been that these super large sample sizes don't tend to make frequentist hypotheses just kind of magically work. But unfortunately, we ran into a problem in one of the studies that the distribution was very bimodal. It was like a U shape where everybody picked either like 0 or 100. And we had a hard time because the pre-registered plan was linear analyses. And I was like, stop the train. You can't do a linear analysis on a bimodal distribution. I mean, you can, but it's not appropriate. So it was kind of a little bit of a fight with the editor who was like, no, you need to do what you said you were going to do. And I was like, but you don't understand. Analysis doesn't mean anything. So adding in like, if the distribution isn't normally distributed, or at least close enough, then we'll pick something else. Okay. If normal distributions are required for your analysis, which most people are frequentists, so it's kind of an assumption on my part. And the analyses could be, okay, you don't have to propose analyses that you aren't familiar with. You could say, traditionally, this design is analyzed using repeated measures ANOVA, and here's how it's calculated. but we're happy to scale it for, you know, these other variables. Okay. So while I think 90% of our studies have used multi-level models to control for the nested structure of the data, you don't have to propose that. Okay. You could say, here's the traditional analysis and here's how it answers the questions. And then once you get with somebody from data and methods, they might say, yes, but you also need to do a level of control for language here, and you should probably scale this to something else. So I want to ease people's fears. If you're used to ANOVAs, you can say, we're going to do an ANOVA. And then somebody else later might be like, but you're not, but I'll help you. Okay. And then the last kind of point here is, here's what we normally do, but we're happy to scale up. So if you have an idea of what variables might influence your results, so you could say, you know, it's not multiple X, it's more of a structured X, right? Like if I know I need to control for country or language because of the cultural component there, I could say, I know I need to control for this, and we'll scale the design up for that. Okay? We don't expect you to be experts at really anything but the like content. Okay? So you can say, here's what we normally do. And we'll adjust for the structure of the data. Okay? So hopefully that eases people's minds. And then a data description. Okay, so which variable are you using to answer this question? What's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? What's the structure? If you're going to do factor analysis, you know, what kind of thing might you expect? We're going to test a 1-factor model and a 2-factor model, see what happens. Okay. And any details that you have on how the data, this really should say structured. Nested is another word for structured here. So what are the clusters in the data? Like participants are tested multiple times, so it's repeated measures. Okay. Or I might be concerned that there are differences across countries. Okay, so I need to control for that somehow. I'll take your suggestion. Or language, what's another one? Lab, I think we've used which research lab it is before as well. Those are kind of the big normal ones. But your hypothesis might be by it's either gender or sex, depending on which one you're wanting, right? So here, just having an acknowledgement that you understand that there might be something else you need to do for the structure of the data. And then how are you going to interpret it? Right? What is the result? And I ask students this a lot, and I'm afraid I'm scaring them because I'm always like, what result would support your hypothesis? And they look at me like I've lost my mind. But like, you know, like what could you find in the data that would say that your hypothesis is supported? Okay. And that could be p-values, it could be effect size, it could be Bayes factor, any kind of way here. But what would happen in the best possible scenario and everything worked out perfectly? Right? And then what would you do if it wasn't that? So just like, how are you going to interpret, like, what is your decision criteria for important and significant, so to speak? Okay. And then any ideas that you might have for how I might visualize this. And when we do the week for power, if you like Lisa's package, it actually makes you some cool pictures. You could say, this is what I'm imagining in a perfect scenario this data would look like. If not, you could just make up some data in Excel, for example. They don't have to be pretty, but just an idea of like, we'll create a bar chart for this. And then what software you want to use for analyses. So if it's got to be specific set of software that's not open source, you probably should tell us this so that we can think about like how to handle that. And try to push you towards open source software, but that's my bias speaking. And feel free to add code examples if you have it in supplemental documents. So you could say, you know, we've done this before, and here's an example of what the code looks like in the supplement. I think I added code to mine, and I don't think anybody looked at it, but you know, I just was kind of like, here I've thought about it, and the code, you know, changed a ton before the project was over. But or just like a little, if you like JASP, you know, having an example of what the analysis looks like in JASP. So here, this kind of is a supporting, you know, previous research has done this, and this is what it looks like. And then I have some suggestions for software. So either R or Python. I don't know that we've had anybody Python. That would be fun. But most psychologists like R instead of Python. So like dplyr, pandas, so using large data sets, those packages tend to work. If you end up in the spot where you need to use Spark, I will happily help you because my institution has a large data scale cluster. Generally, that happens when people are wanting to run their power analysis and they don't want it to take a week. And so that's kind of when we've used these toolkits. I would say that analysis-wise, it hasn't been this big of a problem. Okay. But then for nested data, if you want to talk about using multi-level models, you can use LME4 and LME is really popular. And then I actually went and looked at JASP yesterday, and they actually do have all multi-level models built in. And so if you are like, I don't want to do this coding thing, JASP is a great alternative. I am on the board, so conflict of interest disclosure, but they have done a really great job of making these kinds of more complex analyses accessible. And JASP runs on R in the background. So if we end up needing to do something just a little bit more that they don't have, we can take your code and kind of port it. That's the cool thing about it. So mostly we're trying to avoid proprietary software unless there's a really good reason. Here's an example. MATLAB is very popular for people who do EEG research or some of the brain neuro stuff. That's perfectly acceptable. Okay. Just because though that is sort of more closed source software, you can actually share your code. So our goal here is to get you to share everything transparently. And so that's okay. If you're using SPSS or SAS, we're probably just gonna like push you to JASP. All right, so some quick lessons learned. If you're not familiar with the analyses or hierarchical structure stuff, we can definitely provide you help. So we've got a good set of folks on data methods who are familiar with MLM and multi-level or hierarchical linear modeling or nested models, mixed models, whatever you want to call them, that can make this happen. This is the general analysis that people use, but it's not required. Okay. And then having like the common analysis and its power is actually really helpful. So if you're like, well, this is going to change anyway, why should I do it? Well, it also kind of gives us a feasibility idea. So what you could say is like, normally we do this with one lab and we need this much data using this analysis, right? And that gives us like a really good gauge for feasibility. So we need 60 people from one lab. Okay, well, that's very easy to scale. You know, if one lab represents one country, we can easily collect that kind of data. So having that sort of common rule is actually really helpful. Okay? And generally, I will tell you the analyses do change a good bit during the back and forth on project stuff. Okay? For me, I think mostly what changed was actually the processing, but when you're working with response latencies, that's a very large part of what happens at the end game. So that's how mine changed. And then the analyses are reviewed by the lead team. So other people there helping you and other reviewers from data and methods. So they can help you catch any errors or like moments that you might be like, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Okay. So they can help with code check, review, and making sure. I originally had this slide saying, making sure you don't do anything dumb, but making sure that as many different like conceptual frameworks are thought about, because my experience with multi-level models is very different than other people's. So they could come in and be like, no, you should do this as a level 2 variable instead. Okay. If that doesn't make sense, that's okay, because it barely makes sense to me. And having just different people having that input can help you make sure you're kind of covering your bases, because you still might get to the end and have somebody be like, what were we thinking? Okay. So again, no analysis is perfect. Analyses just get done at some point. So we do have a review process set up. And then as part of this, thinking about the data structure. So if in your methods, you're suggesting that every lab should have their own data set, please don't. First suggestion. Lesson learned the hard way. But if it's because of the machinery or the equipment, they're going to have their own data set that you're going to merge, having a little section about here's how we're going to deal with data merge problems, or we're going to provide every lab a code book, and we won't take their data until their data is in the same structure as everybody else. Okay? So kind of thinking up front about what the final data will look like. Okay? Because everybody having the same variable names and study format will save you a lot of heartache, a lot of crying, a lot of hair pulling. Yeah, from experience. Okay. So if you can do centralized data collection, great, but some of the things that different ideas that people have suggested may or may not allow you to do this. So how are you going to make sure that you don't lose your mind at the end when you have all the data? Because you don't have to have a data management plan. I think originally we had that in these slides, and I don't think it's totally necessary when you're writing the proposal to have a data management plan, but we'll help you write one afterwards. But just having a quick note, like all the data is going to be centralized, so we don't have to worry about variable naming, or hey, every lab's going to have their own data set, and here's what we're going to instruct them to do. Okay. Oh, and here's Savannah slides. So in 2 weeks, we have an open week. But it's power, and then what? Then it's the open week, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I know what 2 weeks stands for. Cool. So think on what you would like to cover. So keep that percolating thought, and we can go over that in a minute. And then, no, there are no dumb questions. And then I've been yelled at before. So here's the slide with all the information of where all these slides live and the recordings. So now we can stop the recording.